Okay, welcome back to our study on the role and place of the nation of Israel in biblical history. Just as we finished our discussion last time, we were talking about two important concepts, and they are the idea of the covenant that God made with Israel being an everlasting covenant. That is, that it would last forever. And the other one that we mentioned just briefly was the idea of being chosen. And it is true, of course, that Israel was a chosen nation. And we have that same idea or concept used in New Testament language as well concerning Christians, that we were chosen in Him before the foundation of the world, wrote Paul in Ephesians 1. But we need to ask the question, what does that mean? Deuteronomy 7, 8, and 9, 3 chapters in a row, expanded that discussion in a negative way, saying what it does not mean in application to the nation of Israel. He said, first of all, it did not mean that they were chosen because they were a mighty nation, that they were more numerous in number than the other nations round about. That's not the reason. In fact, Israel was then and has always been a very small nation indeed. And then chapter 8, he added another one. He said, you were not chosen because you obtained your wealth by your power or might. And in the text in Deuteronomy 8, he refers to copper, that it was a mineral resource in the hills, in the mountains in Judea. And indeed, that was the case, and that it helped to bring wealth to the nation of Israel back in those ancient days, as it is even to this day. And so he said, number two, that it was not because of what you did, but I gave you the land and I gave you the mineral resources in that land. And then in chapter 9, an interesting one because he repeats it 3 times, that Israel was not chosen because of their righteousness. Now that one's a bit surprising. It would seem to me that they were righteous in the sense that they believe in the one true God. But as far as a nation, as far as individually, they had the same problems, the same failures as any other people did. In fact, Paul made that clear in the opening of the book of Romans, that all have sinned, Jew and Gentile, and that God is not just the God of the Jew, but of the Gentile also. He wrote in Romans 3, 29 and 30. So why were they chosen and used by God, and yet the other nations were driven out? Well, the text says that Israel was chosen not because of their righteousness, but because of the wickedness of the Canaanites. That's why they were driven out. You'll remember that God waited until the cup of the iniquity of the Amorites was full. And when it was time to bring judgment upon them and drive them out of the land, he did. That also served as an example and a warning to Israel that the same thing would happen to them, that God would drive them off if they worshiped the gods of the Canaanites in whose land they were now entering. And so Israel was being given here cautions about their behavior and about their acknowledgement of God as the source of their blessings. Remember that there were 2 things given to the nation of Israel. There were a series of blessings that were pronounced upon them, read from Mount Gerizim, and also a series of curses read by the leaders of 6 of the tribes from Mount Ebal. And so you had both these going on, both good things that could and would occur if they kept God's will, and then also the curses that would befall them and that they too would be driven off the land if they did not remember the Lord their God. And so this idea of being chosen was not in a redemptive sense, but it was in the sense of the purpose for which God wanted them to be for him a light to the nations, that is, to the Gentiles. And so they were chosen for a different purpose here. Was it because they were better than, more righteous than, mightier than, or that they did these things and obtained their wealth and their standing by their power and by their might? And so the author here in Deuteronomy 7, 8, and 9 wanted to make that clear. But there's another idea, and that's the idea of what does everlasting or forever mean? It's often used even to this day by leaders in the nation of Israel, that the covenant that God gave to their fathers, even as far back as the beginning to Abraham, that the covenant was an everlasting covenant. Now, of course, that is exactly the wording found in Genesis 17. We find the word covenant 13 times in this chapter, after God cut the covenant with Abraham in chapter 15. And now he's giving to him a covenant of circumcision. This is the seal of that covenant. This finalizes it. And that covenant God made with him, with Abraham, wants to be an everlasting covenant. It says that in verse 7 and in verse 19 of Genesis 17. And so we need to pause here just for a moment and consider what it means for something to be everlasting or forever. We could also use another word, and that is the word eternal. And we have these words both in Hebrew and in Greek, olam in Hebrew and eon in Greek. And we need to remember about language and language usage, that words cannot just be automatically, identically transferred from one language to another. Rarely ever is that the case, that one word in one language stands exactly the same in another. In English, we know quite well what the words forever, everlasting, or eternal mean. But they mean something quite differently in our usage and what they have come to mean in our day than what they meant when used in biblical language, biblical usage in both the Hebrew and in the Greek. And in order to gain a feel for how it's being used, you would need to read where it is used in other places. In other words, in this very chapter, the covenant of circumcision was to be also acknowledged as everlasting or forever. The festivals like the Passover and other things that Israel was commanded were also described as being forever. Well, does that mean that it was to be a part of the nation of Israel and their relationship to God was to be the same throughout the ages, forever, eternally, even in the world to come? Is that what it means? We should come to the conclusion that it does not. And if that is the case, then all of those other things, the sacrifices, the festivals, circumcision, all of those things, the promises concerning the land promise, all of that would be forever. And even among those who make these arguments that it's everlasting or forever, would have to acknowledge that that is not the case. Number one, because Israel, as a modern nation, did not occupy that land from AD 70 to 1948, almost 1900 years. They did not possess that land. They were driven off the land like God warned them. And so we would have to say it wasn't everlasting. It did not last forever because they were driven off for almost 2,000 years. And even for those who are promoting the premillennial dispensational view that the Lord is going to return, the Messiah, and he's going to reign in Jerusalem over Israel for 1,000 years. All we have to do is to pause and point out that 1,000 years is not forever, not in the English language usage. It's 1,000 years. And so they themselves would have to admit that that's not how the word is being used, even in their view of a millennium to come. So what does it mean? Well, in lexicons, in dictionaries of words for Hebrew and Greek, we find that it is used in various ways, but primarily meaning throughout the age or throughout your generations. It means a period of time, sometimes a large period of time, and sometimes a shorter period of time. For example, in Jonah, you have a reference to him being in the belly of the great fish, and there imprisoned forever. And yet it was only for 3 days and 3 nights. And so the usage of this word needs to be carefully approached. And as we've already indicated, it cannot mean and does not mean that God's covenant with Abram still stands even to this day. No, Joshua said that not one word had failed, all had been fulfilled. He said that in Joshua 23 and 24, just before his death. And so we wanted and needed to stop to pause here for a moment to just refresh our thinking about what these two important words mean, and that they are the words chosen and the word forever. And now I want to continue with Old Testament significant passages about Israel, and especially now approaching what the prophets wrote, what they said. Because not only do you have this significant section early in the Bible, in the first 5 books that we have been already looking at with Genesis and Deuteronomy and Exodus, all of those are important passages because they are a beginning introduction of the study of the nation of Israel. But as you go on now, and they're in the land, and they have demanded a king and received it with Saul, and you have 3 kings over united Israel with Saul, David, and Solomon. And then there occurs a great division. 10 tribes broke away, and they're called Israel, or the northern tribes of Israel. And then you have the southern tribe of Judah and Benjamin, a very small tribe. And so these two form the southern nation of Israel, and referred to from that point onward after the division as Judah, and then the northern 10 tribes as Ephraim, or just Israel. And this begins an important part of our study of the nation of Israel in biblical history. Because what you have with this fracture occurring, division occurring within this great nation, is God dealing with these 2 bodies of people. And so over the next centuries after Solomon and after he built the temple that David was not allowed to build, you have prophets speaking to these 2 groups of people and what is occurring politically, religiously in their day, and what is going to happen in the future. And so each one of these messages to these 2 groups need to be considered. And we have to be mindful of to whom the prophet is speaking. Is he speaking to Ephraim? Is he speaking to Israel, the northern 10 tribes, before they were carried into captivity and destruction by Assyria, that mighty empire in the 8th century? Or are the prophets speaking to Judah, that small tribe, the tribe through which the Messiah will come, the one of which David was a member? Is he speaking to Judah? Is he speaking to Israel? And so we'll sum up more about that in just a moment, about how to look at the major and minor prophets. But I want, first of all, just to illustrate something about the reading of the prophets in the Old Testament. And the reason is that they are often used by modern teachers to say that God is speaking to Israel now, and that it applies to them today at 2,000 years after Christ, as if he is speaking directly to modern Israel. And we need to understand that that is simply not the case. But yet these passages are just taken immediately out of the context of the year, the time in which they were spoken, the context of the political situation, and borrowed and removed and brought all the way down to our day. That is a misuse, a terrible misuse and abuse of Scripture. And a good example of that would be Ezekiel 37. It is known as the famous vision of the valley of dry bones. And Ezekiel is told by the Lord to speak and to let Israel know what is going to happen. And here is part of the reading of that, beginning in verse 1. The hand of the Lord was upon me, and he brought me out in the spirit of the Lord and set me down in the middle of the valley. It was full of bones. And he led me around among them, and behold, there were very many on the surface of the valley, and they were very dry. And he said to me, Son of man, can these bones live? And I answered, O Lord, you know. And he said to me, prophesy over these bones, and say to them, O dry bones, hear the word of the Lord. Thus says the Lord God to these bones, behold, I will cause breath to enter you, and you shall live. And I will lay sinews upon you, and will cause flesh to come upon you, and cover you with skin, and put breath in you, and you shall live. And you shall know that I am the Lord. I'm moving down to verse 11 now, where he said to me, Son of man, these bones are the whole house of Israel. All you have to do with each of these prophets is to read the opening words when they identify the time period in which they were writing. And Ezekiel identifies himself as being among the exiles. I'm reading chapter 1, verse 1. In the 30th year, the 4th month, 15th day of the month, I was among the exiles by the Kibar Canal, and the heavens were open, and I saw visions of God. And so Ezekiel, and also along with Daniel, they are identified as prophets of the exile, that they're there in Babylon, and that they are speaking to this destroyed nation, this nation in captivity and carried away to a foreign land. And he is describing them now in this vision of chapter 37, in the vision of the dry bones, as a dead nation, much as you would have scattered bones of people who have died and their flesh has dried and withered away, and only dry bones remain on top of the ground. And that's how Judah is being described by Ezekiel. And he's saying to the nation of Israel that I will breathe breath back into you. I will bring life back to you again, and you shall live. And so this is a great vision, but it cannot and does not apply to the nation of Israel or to Jews generally today. It applies to the exile in Babylon, and that's in the 6th century. They were carried away by Nebuchadnezzar in 586, and the nation virtually destroyed. It was a drain of the nation, of their leaders, of their capable leaders, of their experts in various fields of study. And so it was a brain drain, as was often practiced and is practiced by nations throughout history, where they would carry the leaders off to use them for their benefit in their nation. And so here, Ezekiel is providing a message of great comfort, and that Judah would live again. And indeed, they would be in captivity only for 70 years. And in various stages, they would come out of captivity and rebuild the temple that was destroyed and come back to Jerusalem and establish worship according to the law of Moses. But remember again that when you read anything in the Bible, you should ask, who is speaking? To whom or is he speaking? And what is the time frame here? What's the context? What is the political and religious situation? What is existing around them at that time? I'll give a reason in the next presentation of why the leaders of the premillennial dispensationalists have to use, indeed must use, these scriptures, these prophecies. I'll give a reason for that in another study, but we should raise the question even now, why are they going to the Old Testament? There are prophets in both the Old and the New Testaments. Paul said in Ephesians 2 that the church was built upon the foundation of the holy apostles and prophets, with Jesus Christ himself being the chief cornerstone. And so there were prophets in the Old Testaments, the Old and New Testaments. And there were female prophets or prophetesses. Philip had 4 daughters who prophesied. And so these are often misused by those who want to apply these words to our day. And they cannot, they do not apply, because these are 2,600 years old, these texts that we're reading. And we're certainly misusing them if we take them and bring them down to our day. Ezekiel 37 is a good place to see that. But often what is used also is chapter 40 of Ezekiel through 48. This last section has been very problematic because, once again, what modern teachers do is to take these words and pull them out as if Ezekiel is speaking directly to Jews, to the nation of Israel today, which is not the case. All you have to do is to read the opening words of chapter 40 in this last section, this great vision of Israel coming back to the land, that is, after they were in captivity for those 70 years in Babylon. Chapter 40, verse 1 says this: in the 25th year of our exile, at the beginning of the year, on the 10th month of the year, 10th day rather of the month, in the 14th year after the city was struck down, on that very day the hand of the Lord was upon me, and he brought me to the city. In visions of God, he brought me to the land of Israel and set me down on a very high mountain. So here's the introduction to this significant section, ending Ezekiel's writings. And so here's a powerful and large section, chapter 40 through 48, 9 chapters, in a description using physical terms to refer to their restoration, and as is often the case with the prophets, looking forward to the first coming of Christ, not the second, the first coming of Christ, and what would happen in a spiritual sense in God's final fulfillment of all of these blessings upon all nations, not just the nation of Israel. And so we need to read this with understanding and leave it in the context in which it is found. I want to say a few words about the reading of prophets and how we use the word prophet or prophecies. Often, again, they are used in a way that the Bible does not. Almost exclusively today, you'll hear people talk about prophecies as if they are exclusively about the future. That is just simply not the case. And we should not understand the word prophet or prophecy in that way. One good way to get a feel for this is to use the illustration, and the Lord himself presented it. And it is here in the writing of the book of Exodus in chapter 7, when Moses and Aaron were commissioned to go to Pharaoh and to tell him to release God's people. And you remember that Moses didn't want to go at first because he said he couldn't speak well. He wanted his brother Aaron to go with him or in his place. And finally, the Lord, after rebuking Moses, allowed Aaron to be the spokesman. And here's what he said in Exodus 7, beginning in verse 1. The Lord said to Moses, "See, I have made you like God to Pharaoh, and your brother Aaron shall be your prophet. You shall speak all that I command you, and your brother Aaron shall tell Pharaoh to let the people of Israel go out of his land." Now that's an interesting description and illustration. And that is that in these two brothers going down there, Moses would represent or be as God to Pharaoh. He would give commandments to Pharaoh, telling him what to do. And remember that Moses was raised as a prince in Egypt. He knew the danger that he was in. And he was very reluctant to go and to tell this Pharaoh to let his brethren, the Israelites, go. And Moses here represents God to Pharaoh. And Aaron is fulfilling the role of a prophet. Now this is helpful. It's really helpful because it defines for us the relationship here between God and a prophet. A prophet is one who speaks for another. It does not immediately have the connection with the future. That is not the heart of what is intended by the word prophet or prophecy. Now, when God is speaking, it includes that because only God knows the future. A mere man without the Spirit of God cannot speak concerning the future. So that is true. And that's the reason why we have come to think of prophecies as being future in their time frame. But we need to stop and to go back and to think about what the word prophet means just by itself. It means to speak for, on the behalf of another. So Aaron is speaking for his brother, for Moses, and Moses is in the role of God to Pharaoh. Now, when would those words that Aaron speaks to Pharaoh, when would they be fulfilled? Down in our day? 2000 AD? Of course not. They applied in that day. They were going to happen and began to happen immediately. And therefore, this is a good place to understand what is meant by prophecies. And many people, many teachers almost exclusively misuse the prophets in the Old Testament because they do not acknowledge that those words applied to people, to nations in that day. Just as it did with Aaron and Moses, it applied to Egypt, not to Egypt today, but to Egypt then, centuries before Christ, 1,500 years before Christ. That's when it applied, and not today. And so just as we would not take Exodus and the words spoken by that prophet and apply them today, neither should we take Isaiah or Jeremiah, Daniel, Ezekiel, neither should we take those and the 12 minor prophets and say, oh, that's the Lord giving information that applies to us in our day. Again, 25, 26, 2,700 years ago? Hardly. And so this idea of fleeing to the Old Testament prophets and prophecies for information about the modern situation of Israel is a huge mistake. And we ought to be careful here lest we make it. And there's a whole body of people whose message is constantly about the nation of Israel in the Middle East. They're constantly abusing these passages, and I'll tell you why in another presentation. They must go to these because they have no other place to go, and they dare not go to the New Testament prophets or apostles because they'll get a very different message indeed. So we'll pause there, but I appreciate you for listening. Thank you for continuing the study with us on the role of the nation of Israel in biblical history.